Confessions of a Lovesick Viking by K. Chapter 7. Admission. Stoic ordered Tornado to land at the side of his house just as the sun was beginning to kiss the horizon. He took off his dragon saddle and harness before patting him on the head.
"Well done, Tornado. Same time tomorrow."
Tornado snorted at him with a gruff nod before marching off to his pen to curl up for a nap. Stoic chuckled.
"Rest well, friend."
As he hung up the riding gear on a nail, he thought he heard short pounding sounds coming from the backyard near the woods. The chief lumbered around the corner and was shocked to see Hiccup standing in the middle of the small field, shooting arrows at targets hanging from the trees. Stoic leaned against the house, silently watching his son shoot. He nodded at a few of the hits approvingly.
"You know, son, you're not half bad."
Hiccup flinched at his father's presence, but pulled his last arrow back. "I think there was a compliment in there somewhere." He let the arrow fly and hit a perfect bullseye. He dropped his arms in satisfaction, beyond happy that he'd improved so much in just a day. Stoic laughed and joined his son on the grass, thumping him on the back. Hiccup flailed and wiped out his head, skidding in the grass in front of him. "Just when I was starting to feel manly." Stoic watched him get back up and brush himself off.
"Seems like yesterday you were tripping over yourself and destroying the village single-handedly."
Okay.
"What I mean is that you have come a long way. I'm proud of you, son."
Hiccup looked up at his dad and smiled. "Thanks, Dad." But Stoic wasn't done.
"Truth be told, I didn't think I'd ever see you this close to marriage."
Hiccup slumped and inspected the grip of his bow. "And back to normal," he muttered, but his father didn't hear him.
"But here you are! And you picked the most attractive woman in the village, too. I really didn't see that coming."
"Well, as uplifting as this conversation has been, I should get back to practicing before it's too dark to see." Hiccup moseyed to the trees to retrieve his arrows. Stoic nodded.
"Right, I'll leave you to it then."
He watched his son yank arrows out of all the targets he had set up across the lawn or hung in trees. He suddenly was hit with the realization that his only son was going to be getting married soon. Odin's beard, wasn't he just 3 running around at people's feet asking 1,000,001 questions with wide green eyes? He still remembered the day his Valhararama taught their son how to write. Oh, how annoyed he felt with his son after Val spent hours upon hours teaching him how to write, just to make the discovery that he was left-handed. It was just another hiccup to add to the list of hiccups. But he was Hiccup. He had always been different. He never did do things the traditional Viking way. He was always curious, sarcastic, a bit cynical at times, with a good ration of attitude, and he had an eye for detail. He not only saw detail in objects that most people didn't catch, but also looked for the brightest in people and dragons alike. Hiccup was never quick to judge, but was always quick to forgive. If anything, Hiccup's only real flaw was how he held in his feelings and emotions. He still locked away his feelings like he did as a young teen. He didn't want to talk about his problems, but usually spilled his thoughts with a gentle prod. Hiccup was a better man than Stoic realized. He didn't know when it happened exactly, but it all started with that dragon. Toothless brought out the best in Hiccup. He helped the boy move on from his problems, focus on the good in people, and always have an optimistic attitude. That dragon helped his boy grow up. Hiccup placed an arrow in his quiver and walked over to the last few hanging targets. He felt like he was being watched and looked across the lawn to see his dad still standing there. Hiccup looked away and figured his dad would too and go inside. But upon a second glance, his father was still standing there staring at him. He grunted at one arrow that wouldn't come loose. He changed positions under the target, now facing his dad, hoping the new angle would lodge it free, but didn't. Hiccup glanced at his dad again, who was still staring, and sighed. "What?" Stoic blinked out of his reverie.
"Oh, nothing."
"Come on now." Hiccup grit his teeth, trying to pull the arrow out. Then he said in a mock Viking accent, "What's on your mind? Out with it." Stoic chuckled and walked over to him, pulling the arrow out of the target easily. Hiccup huffed and took it from him. "Thanks, but really, why are you staring? Is there something on my face?" He subconsciously wiped his face with the back of his hand to be sure. Hiccup moved over to another target with 3 arrows in it as Stoic shrugged.
"I was just thinking."
"About?" Hiccup pressed. Stoic sighed and looked off into the sunset. Hiccup furrowed his brow. His father never was one to hold back his thoughts. Or maybe he was nervous? Nah, the sunset was playing tricks.
"I owe you an apology, Hiccup."
Hiccup nearly choked on his spit and recovered with a short cough. He paused in retrieving an arrow and stared at his father. What? Why? Stoic looked back up at his son, whose green eyes were gleaming in the sunset, while Hararama's eyes did that too. He almost smiled at the memory.
I haven't been the best father to you.
Hiccup's eyebrows raised. Oh, Dad, that's...
Nope, I have to say this.
Stoic stopped his son's excuses before they could begin. Hiccup's eyes jumped to the arrows. He'd listen, but he couldn't keep eye contact. Stoic took a deep breath.
You're 21. You're about to propose to Astrid.
He lightly chuckled, and Hiccup's lips quirked out an almost smile.
It really is amazing how far you've come.
Stoic paused and looked down at the ground.
But it's terrible how much I missed.
Hiccup stayed silent, stroking the feathers on an arrow. Stoic shook his head, seemingly frustrated.
I was too focused on all the hiccups, and not the hiccup.
Hiccup's eyes lifted to his father's face, who looked at him at the same time.
And I'm sorry for that. I was too blinded by my own pride.
Hiccup's eyes darted around and he tried to think of something to say. This wasn't like any normal conversation where no response would be okay. He had to say something here. But what? A large black figure swooped into land, kicking up dust as he did. Toothless bounded over and nudged Hiccup's left hip. He pet his dragon on the head, but didn't let himself get distracted. But Toothless's arrival actually gave him a response. He actually smiled a little as he quietly replied, Dad, I forgave you a long time ago. As I did for everyone. That first year with Toothless helped me realize that I can let the past go, and I can help shape the future. He wet his lips before continuing. And anyway, I'd say I benefited from it a bit. I've been hard on myself, and I'd say it's paid off. Stoic exhaled a short laugh through his nose before lightly shaking his head.
You would have become a great man either way, but you would have benefited with a little love, too.
Hiccup shrugged, rubbing Toothless behind the ear. I knew it was there deep down. It just took a little change to let it show. And losing a foot, he quickly added. Stoic chuckled and nodded. Hiccup shrugged again. I forgave you a long time ago. You don't have to hold yourself to it.
I only do to remind myself to be a father to my son.
Stoic said.
Not the chief.
Hiccup smiled, then nudged his father's meaty arm with his fist. I'd say you're progressing. He walked away to put the last arrows in his quiver, which was full to overflowing. Stoic smiled. A weight lifted in his soul that his son had really truly forgiven him. The conversation seemed over, but he felt he wanted to hang out with Hiccup a little more. Didn't really do that often. Never, actually.
Hiccup!
Hiccup slung the quiver over his shoulder and faced him with an eyebrow raised.
Want to join me and the men in the Mead Hall tonight?
Hiccup's lips pulled into a small smile. He was 21, so he was allowed to visit the hall with the adults at night for ale and merriment, but since none of his friends were there yet, he had never gone. But this was an actual invitation from his father. He gave his father a resolute nod. Let me go throw this stuff inside. It was actually too dark to shoot more anyway, so we had to admit that this worked out. Stoic smiled when his son walked toward the house, both men feeling actually a little excited at this new bonding moment they seemed to have had. It was weird, but it was new. It was progress. Stoic placed a hand on Toothless's snout.
And I suppose I have you to thank. You raised my boy when I wouldn't. Thank you.
Toothless blew hot air out his nose, lighting up his nostrils for a moment in a resilient blue, as if to say, absolutely. Hiccup joined Stoic in the front of the house a few minutes later, and the two walked to the great hall, or what they called the Mead Hall at this hour of the day, when children were in bed and Viking merriment would begin. They walked in silence for a few minutes until Stoic asked how the coded big day plans were going. Good, Hiccup nodded.
You nervous?
I almost proposed to her this morning.
Why's that?
Hiccup felt his ears and neck burn, glad that his hair and shirt covered them. You know, amazing girl, great lesson in archery. Could barely keep the secret to myself.
More like she couldn't keep her hands off you.
Hiccup halted in mid-step and gaped at his father, hoping against all hopes that his father hadn't witnessed him and Astrid earlier that morning. Sure, it wasn't anything new, but that experience was a little more intimate than usual. Stoic kept walking and laughed out loud.
I'm just teasing. You coming or what?
Hiccup jogged to catch up and ran a hand through his hair. Yeah, just teasing. Very funny. The two men continued their banter as they walked up the steps to the great hall. Upon entry, the various men and women inside raised their glasses high to their chief and heir. A few men clapped Hiccup on the shoulder with an excited, "Great to see you here, lad," and "About time you came in for a swig." Hiccup shook his head with a light laugh. Clearly, a few had already had too many swigs. Jensen, the hall's tall blonde tender, slid a couple mugs down the counter to the new arrivals, who scooped them up. Hiccup listened to Stoick's conversation with Spitelout and a few others as he took a drink. It actually was a nice ale with a nutty flavor, and it wasn't too strong. He hoisted himself onto the countertop to get a better view of the hall and nodded at a few people he made eye contact with. Looking down at his cup, he had to grin. He was actually hanging out with the adults, and for the first time he was beginning to feel like one. Astrid sat next to her mother in their family room, knitting a shirt for a family expecting a baby. Her mother was knitting another shirt beside her, lightly humming as she did so, and her father sat in his chair across from them, whittling a pipe. Though she acted as if she hated knitting, Astrid actually rather enjoyed it. It was slow, calming work. It enabled her to create something with her hands when usually she'd prefer to destroy something with them, and it gave her time to sort through her thoughts if needed. At least her mother seemed satisfied that she was helping a fellow villager. Astrid didn't know it, but she had a smile on her face. In fact, she had it on all afternoon. She thought about him on a regular basis already, but today she couldn't get Hiccup out of her mind. The last few years he had really proved himself over and over with dragons and helping his father. But the past 6 months or so, he had really stepped up to the plate to learn to take over as chief one day. Though he was so easily distracted, he was really trying. It was like he woke up one morning and responsibility just hit him in the face. Everything clicked. He was going to council meetings, he was helping Stoick with actual chiefly duties, and not just keeping an eye on dragons or trading kids in the academy. He was making an effort to build relationships with the villagers and other tribes. He was getting it together, and that excited her.
"Alright, Missy, what's on your mind?"
Her father's voice interrupted her thoughts. Astrid looked up at him with a shocked expression. He had set his whittling down on the table beside his chair, and it seemed he didn't just now put it down. A short glance at her mother from the corner of her eye confirmed that she too had put her task aside. Astrid smiled lightly, but inside she kicked herself. They had been watching her for some time, while she cluelessly put all her thoughts on her bumbling baboon of a boyfriend.
"Astrid?"
Olaf asked again. Astrid blinked. "Oh, sorry." Phlegma raised an eyebrow. "What's on your mind, dear?" Astrid pursed her lips, but couldn't hide the smile, making her lips stretch awkwardly. She shook her head. "Nothing?"
Olaf smirked. "Well, there certainly can't be nothing if it's got my girl's attention this much."
Astrid continued her knitting, staring hard at the fibers as if to close the conversation. But she didn't get her stubbornness from nobody. Her parents stared at her firmly until she finally began to fidget. "Well," she muttered, "just, Olaf and Phlegma both tried to hide the smiles. They loved it when they got her flustered because no one else on the island could. Finally, their daughter sighed and slumped. "Hiccup!" "Gah!" Olaf winked at his wife, who laughed. "On the feeling." Phlegma patted her daughter's knee. "He's a good boy, Astrid." "I'd hardly call him a boy anymore," Astrid muttered to herself, but her dad heard her.
"And what would you call him?"
Astrid's left foot began to tap, as it usually did when she grew nervous. Knowing this, Olaf's smile grew. His daughter replied, "A good future chief." This caught him off guard because he was expecting her to say something girly or romantic, but his daughter never ceased to surprise him. She was good. Olaf picked up his boodly again.
"Yes, I'd say he's doing much better these past years."
"He's doing amazing," Astrid added, the smile coming back to her face. She focused it back on the knitting and continued, "It's like he finally understands that he has people to look out for, and those people are looking up to him. We want him to lead us one day, and he's finally shown some real effort to be prepared for it. He's actually building relationships with the people he's going to lead one day." Olaf nodded slowly for a few seconds, weighing his next words carefully.
"And what about you?"
Her needles paused for a moment before they picked up again, along with her left foot. "Me?"
"Yes, you."
Olaf pressed, catching Phlegma's warning look. It read, "Don't you dare spoil Hiccup's surprise!" He had told his wife of Hiccup's proposed proposal later that same night. He gave her a light shake of his head to confirm he wouldn't, and continued,
"You and Hiccup have been together 6 years. That's an awful long time. Traditionally, most couples...
Hiccup's never been one for tradition, Dad, Astrid interrupted. And besides, we didn't really consider ourselves a couple until 3 years ago.
True, but still some couples don't even date. They just jump into marriage with both feet after a single meeting.
We first met when we were 3, so I don't think that would have worked out.
Olaf chuckled deep in his chest for a moment. Phlegma smiled at her daughter.
You know, I remember when you were about 8 years old. You came home one day in a foul mood, and neither of us could figure out why. All you could say was, I hate Hiccup. Later on, we found out that he had told you he shut down a night fury.
Her mother rolled her eyes with a light laugh.
He always did say that. Anyway, he dragged you to the woods, made you search for it for an hour, and the dragon he shot down turned out to be a terrible terror. Astrid smiled. No, in turn bit me, even though it was entirely his fault. I remember that.
Yes, I talked to his father about that incident. Her arm was swollen for a week from that bite.
Olaf shook his head.
It was from then on that I decided to keep an eye on that boy.
He smiled mischievously at his daughter then.
But he still managed to capture you.
Astrid smiled and looked back at her needles. She glanced at her right arm where the scar was from the terror's bite. She had long forgotten about that day, but now she remembered it like it was yesterday. Hiccup had felt guilty about that dragon bite for weeks. Probably longer, knowing him. Phlegma continued. You wouldn't talk to him for months. You tried giving you flowers without realizing there was a spider in them, and frightened the whole village when it crawled up his sleeve. Astrid laughs. Yeah, he is funny about spiders. Olaf rolled his eyes and muttered something about manhood. It took me, Gobber, and Stoic to calm him down enough to get it off of him. Phlegma shook her head with wide eyes. That boy was difficult, to say the least. Every child is different, Astrid defended. Hiccup just got a lot more flack than the rest of us. Her parents nodded abashedly, still hating to admit the fact that she was right. But he turned out quite all right for it all, I'd say. Astrid relaxed. Yeah, I'd say so, she quietly agreed, the smile coming back to her face. Olaf paused in his whittling and looked at her again. The look on her face, the way she defended him. Hiccup had professed his love for her already, but Olaf had yet to hear his daughter really truly voice her affections for him. But the look on her face and the way she talked about him confirmed it all. You love him. Astrid's fingers slowed to a stop, and she looked at her father. She considered his expression calm, mindful, wise. She respected her father with her every breath, and she so wanted him to approve of Hiccup. I do. Her father smiled with a resolute nod. That's what I wanted to hear. Astrid cocked her head. Why? Unbeknownst to Astrid, Phlegma's eyes snapped sternly to her husband. He made no expression back at her, but he calmly confessed, You've been with that boy for 6 years. It's about time you voiced your feelings about him. Astrid nodded, a little confirming his statement. Phlegma relaxed and set her knitting aside. All right, dear, you've knit enough tonight, I think. You should head to bed. It's getting late. Astrid nodded again, bid her parents good night, and went to her room. As soon as they heard the door close, Phlegma hoarsely whispered, You are going to spoil...
I will not spoil anything, darling.
Olaf interrupted calmly.
I just wanted to hear her side.
Our daughter is not daft, as you well know. It's going to happen in 3 days, almost 2. There's not much time, but there's plenty enough for her to figure it out.
Olaf shook his head with a chuckle. She won't. We know Hiccup enough to know that he won't let the surprise slip through his fingers so easily.
Okay, buddy, keep steady, Hiccup called, sitting straight in the saddle, his bow drawn. Toothless snorted at him, trusting that the man on his back wouldn't accidentally shoot him. They flew at a decent speed, about 50 feet off the ground, the trees rushing past them. The targets came into view, and Hiccup focused on the first one. Use your core, Astrid's voice rang in his ear. He steadily exhaled and let the arrow fly. He didn't look to honestly see if he hit the target, for the next one was coming up. He'd had fish legs time out specific placements of the targets, so he'd have time to practice pulling out arrows as they flew, but no leisure time. Just enough. Hiccup pulled out another arrow, aimed and shot it at the second target. Toothless swooped around a bend, and Hiccup saw 2 targets hanging above his head on a rock overhang. He quickly notched 2 arrows and hit each target spot on. Another line of targets appeared on the ground ahead. Hiccup was able to shoot them all a lot smoothly this time, finally getting the feel for shooting while flying. When he finally hit the last target, he asked Toothless to land at the first target. When they got there, they heard cheering. The duo turned and saw his friends all high-fiving or cheering at them. Astrid had her hands on her hips and a smile. "Well done, you hit most of them."
"Did I?"
Hiccup asked, sliding off Toothless. He looked at the targets and was surprised that indeed, out of the first 5, 4 had an arrow on it and somewhat hit on center.
"Wow," he muttered. "Not bad for a first run. But, of course, this only the first group.
Snotlat reminded.
Let's check out the others. Maybe we'll meet the windstorm in the river while we're at it."
"Don't even start," Hiccup growled, earning a few snickers from the others. But he gave a wistful smile a moment later. The other shots were just as successful. Out of the 30 targets altogether, Hiccup had successfully shot 24. Fishlegs nodded approvingly.
80% on the first try. Great job."
Hiccup was stunned.
Thanks. Let's just hope that wasn't just pure luck."
Astrid slapped his arm. "No, you've been practicing your shots all day and hitting bullseyes like none other. You're practically a prodigy."
Hiccup raised an eyebrow. "Or I just had a phenomenal teacher."
Astrid rubbed her knuckles against his sleeve. "Well, I try anyway."
"Ugh, all this flirting."
Snotlat sighed, clearly miffed. Fishlegs rolled his eyes.
"It can be worse, you know."
"Fish has a good point," Hiccup conceded, his eyes still looking into hers. "I could start kissing her."
"Or we could go set up some moving targets."
Toughnut ran off to grab a few targets.
"Wait, what?"
Hiccup jerked, watching as Roughnut and Snotlat joined him.
"How are you going to do that?"
Astrid looked concerned. "Yeah, I mean, that's a logical thing to learn because not all targets will be immobile, but..." She tapered off when the twins began tying targets to barf and belch. Hiccup, Astrid, and Fishlegs gaped at them.
"You've got to be joking."
Hiccup finally spoke. Fishlegs vehemently shook his head.
No, we're not doing that until his accuracy is 100%. I'll put my foot down."
"Hey, 80% is pretty good." Roughnut smiled at him flirtatiously, hopping on barf. Fish scowled at her. You would not be moved by a mere facial expression.
Hiccup sputtered. "Not good enough when I can risk shooting you, Tough, or your dragon. Absolutely not."
"Not yet, anyway." Astrid raised an eyebrow at him. "We'll try it sometime, but not today. Keep practicing what you were doing there. I'll take care of them." Hiccup sighed heavily, thankful that she agreed with him.
"Thank you."
He kissed her cheek and hopped back on Toothless. Astrid watched him take off before heading over to the others with Fishlegs. "So, Fish," she began.
Yes?"
he squeaked, afraid of what she'd ask. "Hiccup seems pretty, I don't know, distracted with a lot of things lately." Astrid looked at him firmly. "Do you know why?" Fishlegs placed his hands behind his back.
No, I know nothing."
"Oh, come on," Astrid growled, her eyes narrowing. "He's been hiding something since Johan was here."
"And you can't wait just a little bit longer?"
Fishlegs asked, then slapped his hands to his mouth. Astrid smiled victoriously. "Oh, so he is hiding something."
"No! Yes! I mean no!"
Fishlegs spluttered, slapping his hands to his mouth again. Astrid watched Hiccup and Toothless fly by and shoot the targets again, this round's accuracy much better than the last. And they were flying faster this time. She looked back at Fishlegs, who was now scowling at her. "What? I can't stand secrets!"
"Astrid!"
Fishlegs sighed, suddenly very serious. Astrid closed her mouth, wondering what he was going to say.
"Don't make me spoil anything. He wouldn't want that."
Astrid took in his almost desperate expression. She finally nodded. "All right, I'm sorry."
"It's okay, just don't ask around anymore. It's nothing you won't love."
"Is it for my birthday?"
"Stop asking questions!"
Fishleg waved his arms around maniacally. Astrid laughed. All right, sorry." Hiccup and Toothless swooped around the corner and came in for a landing. Astrid joined the twins in trying to untangle their dragon from some rope. Fishlegs scrambled over to Hiccup, who slid off Toothless.
"Hiccup!"
he whispered hoarsely.
"She's on to you."
"Who?"
"Astrid!"
Hiccup snorted. "Oh, Fish, she's always on to me." Fishlegs deadpanned.
"Not what I'm talking about."
"Sorry." Hiccup grinned. He leaned against Toothless. "What do you mean?" Fishlegs glanced over at Astrid, who was occupied, and he whispered,
"The big day."
Hiccup's brow furrowed. "What did you say?"
"I told her to stop asking questions and that you wouldn't want the surprise to be blown."
"Wait, you said that?"
"Not explicitly word for word."
"Oh, man." Hiccup sighed, running a hand through his dark, unruly hair. "So she's figured out that I have something planned. That's it. She has no idea what it is."
"As far as I know."
Fishlegs confirmed.
"But she knows you're hiding something."
Hiccup bit his lip.
Maybe I should talk to her, just appease her for another day and a half so she doesn't find something out. I mean, she'll be surprised either way, but I'd really like for her not to be expecting anything. Well, she asked if it had to do with her birthday, so I think that's out. Hiccup groaned deep in his throat. All right, I'll probably talk to her then. Thanks, Fish. No problem.
Astrid and Hiccup walked side by side through the forest a few hours later, the dragon rumbling through the woods ahead. They had spotted a couple deer a few minutes before and were now bent on catching dinner. Or in Toothless's case, just killing an innocent animal just for the heck of it. He did that to squirrels all the time, but they were annoying and therefore deserved it. Hiccup felt bad for the deer, though. Astrid looked over at her boyfriend, taking in his expression. He looked to be deep in thought, silently contemplating something as they walked in silence. She faced forward and decided to break it. Okay, you got me out here. What are you thinking? Hiccup smiled wistfully, having forgotten in his thick train of thought that he had indeed asked her to take a walk with him that evening.
I'm thinking a lot of things.
From experience, I know that you'll spill once you start, so pick a thought and start yakking.
Hiccup laughed. Oh no, I'm not spilling this time.
Astrid rolled her eyes. Sure!
No, really. Hiccup shook his head. We're here to talk about one thing.
The cove came into view, and the couple walked in. What's that? Astrid asked, sitting down on the ground, with her legs crisscrossed and leaning her back against a large boulder behind her. Hiccup seemed nervous for a moment, running a hand through his hair and down his neck. He held his hand there at his jawline as he looked down at her, thinking hard. Astrid traced his jawline with her eyes, wishing he was closer. As if reading her thoughts, he sat down in front of her, sitting on his foot and his prosthetic bent in front of him. He set his elbow on his knee and messed with a few strands of hair again before looking back at her. Astrid waited patiently for him to speak. When he did, his voice was slow and calm. Do you trust me? Her brows furrowed immediately. His face remained unchanged, as if anticipating such a reaction. What? She asked. Of course I do. Why would you? He held up a hand and she stopped. Something reminded her of Stoic when he did that. He spoke before she could think on it further. You know why I'm asking? He gently replied. Astrid thought about it, her face portraying her confusion, and then she suddenly realized what he was referring to, that blasted secret that he was hiding from her. Oh! She looked at her boots impatiently. The corner of Hiccup's mouth twitched. He took a deep breath through his nose, his eyes not leaving her face for a moment. If you must know, yes, I'm hiding something from you. Yes, a few people know about it before you. But it's not something that is bad. We talked about this, remember? He cocked his head down to make her look at him. She sat up straight when she noticed, and he smiled. He scooted forward, crossing his legs and sitting close so their legs touched. Reaching forward and taking her hands in his, he slowly stroked them with his thumbs. He looked back into her eyes and slowly asked, Do you trust me? Astrid caught his meaning this time and nodded slowly. Whatever secret he was withholding from her was special. It had to be beyond special if he was stressing it this much. What could it possibly be? How much longer do I have to wait? She asked with a little whine, looking back down at their hands. Hiccup breathed a short laugh and kissed her forehead. Not long now. Astrid lifted her head and stroked the side of his nose with hers, sending shivers up his spine. I suppose I can wait a little longer. I sure hope so. Wouldn't want to spoil the surprise. Hiccup breathed, his eyes darting from hers to her mouth. Astrid smirked and widened the gap between their faces, leaning back against the boulder again just to tease him. He frowned playfully. What's that look for? Her face didn't change, yet she whispered, Why don't you come over here and find out? Hiccup thought about it for a second. Here was his, hopefully, future bride sitting in front of him and beckoning him closer, and he just couldn't venture forward. To kiss her now would make things too difficult. He would probably blurt it out while he was getting lost in the moment, and then their conversation would be for nothing. Still, she did expect him to do something. He grinned at her and raised an eyebrow. Are you sure that's what you want? He asked, his grin stretching wider at the look on her face, bemused but still mischievous. Oh, yes, she said, leaning forward a hair. Unless you're scared? Oh, I'm not scared. Hiccup suddenly leaned forward and grabbed her around the waist. Astrid let out a small squeak of surprise as Hiccup stood up and she felt her feet leave the ground. He began to carry her over to the pond.
she shrieked, now flailing her arms and legs about. What? You asked for it! Hiccup teased, gripping her torso as hard as he could. As soon as he reached the shore, he threw his body forward so that Astrid would hit the water on her back. She screamed indignantly as most of her body was submerged, but her reflexes were lightning fast as she grasped Hiccup's upper arms on the way down, now pulling him down with her. His entire head sank under the surface of the water for a moment, then when he emerged, he flipped his hair around, causing droplets of water to fly in all directions. Hey! He shouted, grinning from ear to ear. You're going to pay for that! Catch me first! Astrid began to run away from him and deeper into the water. Hiccup wasn't much of a swimmer, even when he had 2 feet. And with his prosthetic weighing him down, he was certainly not going to break any speed records. His shirt was also a thicker material and was weighing him down the wetter it became. He quickly popped off both his prosthetic and his shirt and pitched them at the shore before following his girlfriend deeper into the pond. While her back was turned to him, he took a silent breath and dove onto the water. Astrid whipped around, splashing water in his direction, but he wasn't there. Hiccup? She asked, turning around in all directions in search of him. A pair of hands gripped her waist suddenly, and she screamed as Hiccup tugged her under. She was stronger than him in water, therefore he was unsuccessful. He emerged, his hair dripping and his mouth spraying water in all directions. She turned and flailed, slapping his bare chest. When had that happened? So hard it would surely leave hand marks. He arched his fingers up the sides of her waist, making her howl in laughter. His grin broadened. I think I win. Not on your life! She cried in between laughs, putting her feet on his stomach and shoving off of him. Hiccup reflexively grabbed by the ankle. Where do you think you're going? Away from you! Oh, come on, baby, don't be like that. Don't call me baby! He yanked her even closer, a flirtatious look on his face. And what if I do? I think you know the repercussions. Astrid stared hard into his eyes, doing her best to keep up the intimidating look, but the smile on his face, the ragged breathing, his bare-toned chest right in front of her. There was no way. She let up the look, but did give him a good slap. Ow! He whined. No, but I'm wet! Astrid rolled her eyes. Don't be a baby! Okay, so I can't call you baby, which is in fact a good name, but you can call me a baby, which is in fact derogatory. Hiccup deadpanned. Hey, you said it, not me. Astrid shrugged. Hiccup rolled his eyes, but couldn't hide the smile. Toothless drifted over to them, using his tail as a rudder. He sprayed water in their faces when he exhaled, a few bubbles drifting past them. Toothless! Hiccup flicked his dragon's nose. Toothless stared at him, and then glanced at Astrid. Hiccup looked from one to the other, Astrid watching on with an amused smile. I think he's trying to tell you something. The Adam's apple in Hiccup's throat bobbed. Yeah, probably. Toothless moved deep in his throat for a moment. Hiccup stared at him hard. When Toothless's eyes flicked back to Astrid again, Hiccup followed suit. Bubbles erupted from Toothless's submerged snout as he chortled. Hiccup shoved his friend's nose away. Be quiet, you! Astrid put a hand to her mouth to hide her laugh. Shirtless as he was, she could easily see the tone of red creeping up the back of his neck. Sometimes I wish dragons could talk. I would love to know what he's actually saying. Hiccup deadpanned. Probably something vastly inappropriate. Toothless chortled again from a few feet away, actually sending ripples through the water. In the water, they could even feel the vibrations coming from his thick chest. Astrid sighed and leaned her head back into the water, her ears going under and muting the sounds of the cove. Hiccup watched her relax, and he couldn't help the loving smile that crossed his face. She looked over at him, raising an eyebrow. What? She raised her head. Hiccup shook his head. Nothing. He looked up at the sky, noting the oncoming sunset. Well, we should probably get out, so we are dry enough when we get back. Yeah, Astrid agreed. The couple treaded through the water side by side until it was shallow enough to wade to the shore. Hiccup waded in the shallows while Astrid retrieved his prosthetic, tossing it to him in a splash. He clipped it back on and joined her on shore, picking up a shirt. Got wetter than I thought. Stormfly, he called, hanging the garment on a thick branch. A little heat? Stormfly blasted a small fire underneath the branch, the heat carrying up to dry the shirt. Thanks, girl. Hiccup patted her nose and turned back to Astrid. She was wringing out her hair, her headband lying on a rock beside her, and her hair ties on her wrist. His eyes widened in surprise. He hadn't seen her hair outside of its single braid in a long time. He couldn't remember when he last saw it down.
In fact, it was a lot longer than he expected. Her hair hung past the middle of her waist, almost to her lower back. Apparently the braid made it a lot shorter. Then again, it wasn't just any old braid. It looked like it had a ton of twists and turns to it. Man, hairdos were complicated. "You just going to stand there staring at me?" Hiccup blinked. Sorry," he confessed, having no other response. Astrid giggled. "It's fine, you just look deep in thought."
"I was."
"What were you thinking about?"
"Your hair,"
he admitted, walking over to her.
"It's really long."
"Yeah, I need to get a cut."
"What? No, don't!"
Hiccup interjected. Astrid raised a surprised eyebrow at his outburst, and he looked away shyly.
I like it."
Astrid sighed. "It's so hard to take care of when it gets this long." Hiccup looked back at her, his embarrassment gone.
He shrugged. "It's your hair, though. Don't make yourself uncomfortable because of what makes me happy."
Astrid gave him a gentle, almost innocent look. "But I like making you happy." A warm feeling warmed his chest when she said that. He smiled but couldn't think of a response. Instead, he resorted to rubbing the back of his neck and looking away. Astrid glanced behind him. "You might want to check your shirt before it goes up in flames." "Ah!" Hiccup whirled around, his one shoe squishing with the water inside it. The shirt was fine and mostly dry, so we pulled it down. Astrid watched him almost sadly as he put his shirt back on. He was more toned than he appeared. She knew from seeing him in the forge so often that his arms were strong, and anyone who rode a dragon half as often as he did had strong legs. So why didn't she think his torso would be just as muscular?
"You're just going to stand there staring at me?"
Hiccup echoed softly. Astrid blinked just as he had, and a little heat gathered in her cheeks. She gathered her hair up at the base of her neck and tied it into a messy bun. Hiccup noticed how much she looked like her mother when she wore it down like that. "Well, we better go before our feet turn to prunes inside our sopping shoes," Astrid joked, picking up her headband. Hiccup grinned and held out his hand to her. She pressed her palm into his, intertwining their fingers as they walked. Toothless and Stormfly both scampered on ahead as they had earlier. It was almost as if the dragons were trying to give the couple some alone time. They walked in silence. As they walked, Hiccup holding her hand tight against his. Astrid had noticed his fingers lightly shaking when she first grasped them, and now wondered if he held her hand so tight to steady them. Was he nervous about something? "Are you okay?" she quietly asked, nearing the edge of the forest where the village lay just beyond. Hiccup looked at her quickly.
"Yeah, just enjoying the silence."
She knew he was covering up his nervousness by pinning his silence on the hour. She knew not to ask questions from their previous talk, but something was nagging at the back of her mind. If only she could put her finger on it. They reached the forest line too soon. They released hands and stared at each other for a moment, Hiccup shoving his hands in his pockets. The crickets chirped around them. A few dragon roars could be heard in the distance, mixed with hearty Viking laughter. But they tuned it all out, too engrossed in each other to care.
"You're so pretty,"
he whispered. Astrid smiled at him for a moment before suddenly sliding her arms around his middle, her face nuzzling his chest. He was surprised at first, but hugged her tight to his body. The smell of her hair was enough to make him dizzy, but he stood firm, never wanting to let her go. "I love you, Hiccup." Her words only made his heart swell, and he held her tighter, burying his face in her neck.
"I love you too, Astrid."
Astrid raised her head and nudged his face up with her nose. She planted a firm kiss on his lips, her hands gently resting on his cheeks. She pulled away slowly, pulling his lips with hers until they parted with a light smack to break the night silence. They blinked their eyes open again, neither wanting to leave, but she pulled away and walked toward the general direction of her home. "Good night, Hiccup." Hiccup nodded dumbly.
"Yeah, night."
As soon as she was out of sight, he teetered and leaned against the nearest tree, which unfortunately was not substantial enough to hold his weight. "What?" he gasped as gravity took its course. He managed to grab the small spindly trunk as he went down. He hung just a few inches above the ground and rolled his eyes. Clumsy! The branch he held snapped and sent it flying. Gah! He plopped his arms to the ground in a heap beside him, glaring at the small tree waving back into its original position. He rolled his eyes. "Thor, even the trees are mocking me!"